And we're going to do what Trump promised and hasn't done. We're going to drain the old swamp. So if you're not familiar with the 10th Amendment Center, you can go to 10thamendmentcenter.com and read about it, because I'm not going to tell you. Now I'll give you the brief overview. We do basically two things. We teach about the Constitution, originalism, what it was actually intended to do, and then from an activism point of view, we look for ways to use state, local, and individual action to undermine overreaching federal power. So that's our work in a nutshell. Back during the time when they were debating the ratification of the Constitution, the people that supported the document promised that it was going to create a decentralized system with relatively little power in the general government. In Federalist number 45, James Madison wrote that the powers delegated to the federal government by the proposed Constitution are few and defined. And he said those which remain with the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So federal government, few and defined powers. Now I ask you, does that remotely resemble the system of government that we have in the United States today? Of course it doesn't. The federal government has inserted itself into virtually every corner of our lives. There are bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, D.C. who are dictating how much water you can have in your toilet and how much, what type of light bulbs you can screw in your light fixtures. That is not few and defined powers by any stretch of the imagination. Now, this is a big problem to me because, in my view, the biggest threat to liberty is centralization of power, centralization of authority. Now, in my personal and never to be humble opinion, all governments suck. Okay? Local governments suck, state governments suck, the federal government suck. The problem with centralization is it puts all the suck in one place. And you end up in a situation where everything is dictated by a small group of people. At least when you have a decentralized system, you have some competing jurisdictions that will butt heads and check and balance each other. And in the last resort, you have someplace else you can go. You know, if things get really bad in Kentucky, I can go to Tennessee. I don't know why I would do that, but I could. When things get really bad in the United States, it's very difficult to bug out of the United States. So, in my view, the centralization of power is an extreme problem, and it's getting worse and worse and worse as we go along. It's weird to me because so many people instinctively understand that they wouldn't want Kroger to be the only place you could buy your groceries, right? Because we recognize that if that were the case, prices would in all likelihood go up, service would in all likelihood go down. There'd be all kinds of problems. We don't want a monopoly in grocery. Yet the same people who will not in strong agreement with that will say, but we need a monopoly government in Washington, D.C. because it's more efficient, or some other retarded reason like that. We don't need centralization, we need decentralization. That was the system that the founders intended for us to have. That is this system that, quite frankly, no longer exists. Now, we could talk for a long time about why that is, and I have a very limited amount of time, so I'm not going to even get into that. The real question is, what do we do about it? What can we do to undermine this tendency towards centralization and this overreaching, overwhelming authority that we see coming from Washington, D.C.? Now, in the United States, most people that are involved in political activism, they have kind of this three-pronged approach, and it all focuses on Washington, D.C. I call it the call your congressman, vote the bums out, sue in federal court. Those are kind of the three things that people like to do. The problem with that is when you vote the bums out, you end up with new bums. People in Congress ignore you, and the federal courts are staffed with federal employees who almost always will side with the federal government. So, not a real good strategy for dealing with Washington, D.C. We need some other method, some other way to get into the system. See, that's the problem. It's the system. The system is broken. The system is no longer a federal government of limited and defined powers. It's this government of overreaching and indefinite power. And so we could elect a new president, or we could get a great new congressman, but that's not going to help because the system's still broken. It's like trying to put a new driver in a car that's broken down and on blocks. car's still not going anywhere. You can have the best driver in the world, not go anywhere, the system is broken. So what do we do about it? Well, James Madison actually gave us a strategy before the Constitution was even ratified, and it was later built up on, and a lot of people call it nullification. I could talk here for about an hour about nullification, and I don't have that time, so I'm going to pitch my book instead because I'm a good capitalist. This is Our Last Hope, and this actually outlines the constitutional, the philosophical, the moral basis for this idea of nullification, which is simply that states have the authority and the right and the power to push back, ignore, defy, block implementation of unconstitutional federal acts. I'm just going to talk practical for today because we're all practical people, right? We're people that are involved and we want to do something. So what can we do? Well, like I said, James Madison gave us that blueprint in Federalist 46. Notice it was right after Federalist 45 where he was talking about the fact that the federal government was going to be limited. Well, people were asking the question, how is this government going to be limited? How is this piece of paper going to ensure that this government remains limited? And Madison said, well, there's a thing that we have that we can use against the federal government, and that's the states and the people. And in Federalist 45, he said that there was a means of opposition that is powerful and at hand. And he listed a number of things that states could do if the federal government committed an unwarrantable act. Interestingly, he also mentioned that they could do the same thing for a warrantable act. So in other words, a constitutional act that just happened to be unpopular. So we don't even have to limit this to constitutional issues. This is something that states and individuals can do. And he said things like protest, or we can, the governors can do different things. But the most important and significant thing that Madison mentioned was he said a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's the exact words that the father of the Constitution used, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. People look at me and go, well, that's radical. Well, yeah, it's radical, but it was James Madison. I mean, I don't see a problem with it, right? He said if even one state were to refuse to cooperate, it would create impediments for the federal government. He said if several states were to get together, he said it would create obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. Now, why? Well, James Madison understood something. He understood that the federal government was going to need the cooperation and the participation of the states to get anything done. And this is absolutely and undeniably true. The federal government depends on state and local action to do almost everything that it tries to do. If you've ever watched a drug raid, like on TV, and you see a drug raid, or God forbid you've experienced a drug raid, you'll see that there's like one DEA agent and 45 sheriff's deputies. Now imagine for a minute if the 45 sheriff's deputies said, yeah, we're not coming along. That one DEA agent's going to have a hell of a lot harder time enforcing this federal drug law. That is the basic underlying strategy that we can use. We can deny the federal government the assistance and the cooperation that it needs. We've seen this work. We've seen this work with marijuana. We've seen this work with hemp. Caleb mentioned right to try. When states simply stop cooperating with the federal government has a very difficult time enforcing its laws. And then you know what happens? Eventually people in DC start going, well, looks like we can't enforce hemp anymore. Guess we'll legalize hemp. And then they take credit for it and act like they're all great and wonderful and they did this wonderful thing. Do you realize that there were 17 states at the time that Trump signed the Farm Bill? There were 17 states that were openly defying the federal hemp rules, even the ones promulgated under Obama in that Farm Bill in 2014 that allowed hemp for research purposes. Even states like Kentucky that were federally compliant weren't federally compliant because the hemp law, up until Trump signed that bill, was that it was for research only. There was not to be any commercial sale of hemp. Well, I'll tell you what, I was walking into a local shop and buying CBD oil long before President Trump signed that bill. So there were like 30 states that were actively defying the federal government. They can't enforce that. They can't enforce the marijuana laws. We've seen this work. It is a powerful strategy. So we usually talk about as the foundational issue is marijuana. Started in 1996, California legalized medical marijuana at that time. The federal government, they came down hard. They sent the DEA in. There was a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court said, oh, absolutely, California can't do this. And California did it anyway. Now we have 33 states that have legalized medical marijuana. We have 10 states that have legalized marijuana for adult use. Federal government's not really enforcing marijuana laws. It's not prosecuting medical marijuana laws at all. So we've seen this evolution through this time when states don't cooperate, the federal government can't do what it wants to do. We want to take this marijuana strategy and apply it to pretty much anything you can imagine. So guns. This drives me crazy. Gun people are wimps compared to weed people. Because gun people want to go to the courts and get the court's permission, and if the courts don't get permission, oh, darn it. Weed people are just like, screw you, I'm smoking weed anyway. We need more gun people like weed people, and we need states that are gun states to say, you know what, we're not going to enforce your federal gun laws. Now here is the beautiful thing about this, and I'll close with this little factoid that a lot of people don't know. This is one case where we actually have the federal courts on our side. Now, I'm not a big fan of federal courts. I like to make fun of them. I call them federal employees. I say they wear black dresses. I don't like them. And for the most part, I really don't think that they have nearly the authority that they should. But from a practical standpoint, it's good when the Supreme Court agrees with something. And the Supreme Court has held since 1842 that state and local governments do not have to use their resources and they do not have to use their personnel to enforce federal laws or implement federal programs. It's called the anti-commandeering doctrine. It's based on basically 5 major Supreme Court cases. So when you tell somebody, hey, we don't have to cooperate with enforcing marijuana laws or gun laws or the health care bill or EPA mandates or whatever it is, and they go, oh yes you do, federal supremacy, you can say, oh no you don't, the Supreme Court says. Because they like to say the Supreme Court says to me all the time, so I get to say it to them, it's fun. So we have this tool at our disposal. And this is why you'll notice that Trump, for all of his yapping, hasn't really done anything about sanctuary cities. That's because they can't. Because all sanctuary cities are really doing is they're saying, we're not going to use our resources and personnel to enforce immigration law. Now, no matter what you think about immigration, that's the right of that jurisdiction to do that. The federal government can't do anything about it. And the reason the right is so mad about sanctuary cities, it's not because it doesn't work. It's because they know it does work. So I say take that strategy and apply it to other things. Let's make gun sanctuary states. Let's make marijuana sanctuary states. Let's make food sovereignty sanctuary states. We can do all of these things. That's what we're doing every day at the 10th Amendment Center. We use the anti-commandeering doctrine to create legislation that basically withdraws state and local enforcement in cooperation with federal programs and enforcing federal laws. So that's what we do. Let's keep this short because I know you all have got a lot of other things to do and you want to eat, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I do have these books available if anybody would like to purchase, $20. I can slide your card if you want. Thank you guys.
Right. Here.